Port Sea is very small, a handful of shops and cafes against a larger backdrop of big houses, looking aloof and broody in the wispy fog, but famously well heeled. A beach hut had just sold at auction here for 185,000 Australian dollars. Not the beach house, you understand, but the beach hut. A simple wooden shed with no electricity, water, or any features at all other than proximity to sand and water. The purchaser didn't even actually get to own the hut. All his 185,000 Australian dollars bought him was the right in perpetuity to pay the council several $100s in annual rent. The huts, which only locals are allowed to acquire, are immensely prized possession. The one that had just been sold had been in the same family for 50 years. I had coffee to warm up before continuing on to the Mornington Peninsula National Park, which covers the last nubbin of land before it meets the sea at a hilly outpost called Point Nepean, beyond which lies a notorious swirl of water called the Rip, a narrow passage forming the entrance to Port Phillip Bay. Only recently had this land become public. For 100 years, the whole of this area, several hundred acres of the most glorious coastal property in Victoria, was off limits to the public because it was owned by the military, which used it as a firing range. Pause with me for a moment while we put this in perspective. Here you have a country of 3 million square miles, nearly all of it empty and eminently bombable. And here, just a couple of hours drive outside the country's second city, you have a headland of rare and sumptuous beauty and of considerable ecological importance, and from this land you bar the public because you are trying to blow it to smithereens. Doesn't make much sense, what? The upshot is that after many years of wheedling and cajoling, the military was finally prevailed upon to yield a fragment of this land to form a national park. Even so, the army kept about 2/3 of the peninsula and still occasionally lofts bombs into it. In consequence, once you have acquired a ticket of admission at a visitors center on the edge of Port Sea, you have to pass through a 2-mile-long zone of military land on a road lined on both sides with tall fences bearing severe warning of unexploded bombs and the folly of trespass. You can take a shuttle bus into the park or walk. I decided to walk for exercise and set off through the cloaking mist. I appeared to have the place pretty much to myself. I had gone no more than a dozen feet when I was joined by a fly, smaller and blacker than a housefly. It buzzed around in front of my face and tried to settle on my upper lip. I swatted it away, but it returned at once, always to the same spot. A moment later it was joined by another that wished to go up my nose. It also would not go away. Within a minute or so I had perhaps 20 of these active spots all over my head, and I was swiftly sinking into the state of abject wretchedness that comes with a prolonged encounter with the Australian fly. Flies are of course always irksome, but the Australian variety distinguishes itself with its very particular persistence. If an Australian fly wants to be up your nose or in your ear, there is no discouraging him. Flick at him as you will, and each time he will jump out of range and come straight back. It is simply not possible to deter him. Somewhere on an exposed portion of your body is a spot about the size of a shirt button that the fly wants to lick and tickle and turn delirious circles upon. It isn't simply their persistence, but the things they go for. An Australian fly will try to suck the moisture of your eyeball. He will, if not constantly turned back, go into parts of your ears that a Q-tip can only dream about. He will happily die for the glory of taking a tiny dump on your tongue. Get 30 or 40 of them dancing around you in the same way, and madness will shortly follow. And so I proceeded into the park, lost inside my own little buzzing cloud of wool, waving at my head in an increasingly hopeless and desultory manner. It is called the bush salute, blowing constantly out of my mouth and nose, shaking my head in a kind of furious dementia, occasionally slapping myself with startling violence on the cheek or forehead. Eventually, as the flies knew all along, I gave up, and they fell upon me as on a corpse. At length, the flies and I reached the end of the military zone and the beginning of the park proper. Just inside this transition area was a signposted path leading up a medium-sized eminence called Cheviot Hill. This is what I had come to see, for it was at Cheviot Beach on the other side that Harold Holt went for the swim that needs no towel. I followed the path upward through misty groves of low bushy trees, Moona, milkwort, and tea trees, according to helpful notice boards posted at intervals. At the top of the hill, a stiff breeze was running, forceful enough to make me totter when I neglected to brace for it, and here at last the flies gave me a tiny bit of surcease. I stood with the wind full in my face, happier than I can tell you just to be left alone. The view from the top of Cheviot Hill is said to be one of the finest in coastal Victoria, though I cannot vouch for this, as I could see almost nothing. Across a grey-green vale, a mile or so distant, rose another hill at Point Nepean, covered in lazy cloud. Beyond was the notorious Rip, invisible from here. Below me, things were no less impenetrable. I appeared to be perhaps 100 feet directly above Cheviot Beach, but it was like peering into a cauldron. All I could see through the drifting soup was some vague outlines of rocks and an indeterminate expanse of sand. Only the sounds of unseen waves flopping onto an unseen shore made it evident that I had found the sea. Still, I felt a frisson of satisfaction at having reached the scene of Holt's fateful swim. I tried to imagine the scene as it must have been, though it wasn't easy. On the day Holt waded into the surf, the weather was windy but fine. Things were not going very well for him as Prime Minister. His skills lay more in kissing babies and making the ladies tingle. He was evidently a bit of haughty than in running affairs of state, and we may safely assume that he was glad to be out of Canberra for the long Christmas break. Holt came to this beach because he had a weekend home at Portsea, and the army let him stroll on its grounds for the sake of his privacy. So there were no lifeguards, members of public, or even security guards in attendance when, on December 17, 1967, Holt went for a breezy stroll with some friends among the rocks and pounding waves just below. Although the sea was lively and the tide dangerously high, and although Holt had almost drowned there 6 months earlier while snorkeling with some chums, he decided to go for a swim. Before anyone could react, he had whipped off his shirt and plunged into the surf. He swam straight out from the beach, a couple of 100 feet, and almost instantly vanished, without fuss or commotion or even a languorous wave. He was 59 years old and had been Prime Minister for not quite 2 years. His body was never found. Cheviot Beach remains closed to the public, and in any case there was no way down to it from the cliff tops, so I amused myself for a few minutes prowling through a complex of pillboxes and murky concrete bunkers left over from World War II until I walked into a large cobweb, and with an echoing shriek and a few moments of caroming about between walls, low lintels, and other unyielding impedimenta, returned in subdued form to the open air. Rubbing my head and calling round the flies again, I followed the path back down to the road. At the bottom of the hill was a large and struggling cemetery, a relic from when this was a quarantine station. I tried to have a look around, but the flies would give me no peace. I had intended to stroll out to the headland where there was a 19th century fort, but the thought of having the flies as my companions for another hour was more than I could endure, so I set off back along the empty road by which I had come. At the visitors center, I stopped in to have a look at the displays and got to chatting with the park ranger. I asked him how dangerous this stretch of coastline was. "Oh, very," he said cheerfully. He showed me on the marine chart how the currents ran, which is to say, all over the place. If they got hold of you, I gathered, they would pass you around like an unwanted parcel. Even the strongest swimmer would soon be exhausted by the fight. It was mostly to do with the rip, where massive volumes of water rushed through an opening only a few hundred yards across each time the tide rolls in or out. I hadn't realized until I saw the chart just how proximate Cheviot Beach was to this zone of watery turmoil. Even on the map, it looked supremely foolhardy. So it wasn't a good idea for Harold Holt to go swimming out there. Well, I wouldn't go swimming out there, he replied. You know, there's about 100 shipwrecks just along here. He indicated an absurdly modest stretch of shoreline in the vicinity of Cheviot and the Rip. I think you can take it as read that when you've got a stretch of sea that sinks 100 ships, it's probably not the most placid environment for a dip, you know. Isn't it odd that they never found his body? No, this was said without hesitation. Really? I don't understand the dynamics of the sea, but if driftwood and Coke cans are anything to go by, then I thought most buoyant objects ended up on a beach somewhere. Not to be too blunt about it, if you die out there, it doesn't take too long to become part of the food chain. Ah, the thing you have to remember, he added with a sudden, thoughtful air, is that the only thing unusual about the Harold Holt drowning was that he was Prime Minister when it happened. If it hadn't been for that, the whole thing would have been completely forgotten. Mind you, it's pretty well forgotten anyway. So you don't get a lot of people coming here in a kind of pilgrimage? No, not at all. Most people barely remember it. A lot of people under 30 have never even heard of it. He broke off to issue tickets to some new arrivals, and I drifted away to look at the displays of seagrasses and life in rock pools. But as I was leaving, he called to me with an afterthought. They built a memorial to him in Melbourne, he said. Know what it is? I indicated that I had no idea. He grinned very slightly. A municipal swimming pool. Seriously? His grin broadened, but the nod was sincere. This is a terrific country, I said. Yeah, he agreed happily. It is, you know.